have me in video form. I hope that's all right. And I'll need to talk to somebody about being willing to run the class. But there's one more class after this one. This is a fun one. I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. Throughout this class, we've been talking about this model of engagement and empowerment. The last class period was the one time we kind of stepped away from that and looked at the reality that, okay, not everything that's formative in our lives is formative because we're engaging with God. Sometimes life comes tumbling in on us, and the big job that we've got is just to hang on. But through most of this class, we've been looking at this model, this New Testament model of being open to God's presence, being intentionally with God through spiritual activity, and that God then empowers our hearts so that when we rise from our prayer and we go about our life, when something happens that would either tempt us or push us towards destructive behaviors, we find that we have new abilities because of our time with God. That He has energized the parts of our heart that He has raised from death. And that we are more like Christ as we draw near to Him. And that He makes that part of us stronger so that when we get cut off in traffic, which is the example I routinely use, when we're suddenly facing temptation that has always been stronger than us, our time with God makes us the stronger. And it doesn't mean that we're magically poof and we don't have any choices. You can still do evil if you want to. At any point in the Christian life, you can live your life by the flesh. You can do it. But engagement with God opens up other doors that the redeemed are empowered by God to actually live differently. This morning, I want to take a look at something that it's really two windows into the same room in our lives. And it's the reality that not every moment in our life is the same. There's a guy named, we'll take a look at two things here. Phasic spirituality comes from a man named Adrian Van Kam. And the life questions actually come from Gordon MacDonald, one of my professors in my doctoral program. So, Adrian Van Kam, can you read that? Well, that's too bad, because that's probably the font size I use for...
I can read it.
Well, I don't know what the problem is here.
Under 40.
Chose to sit in the back. I'm just saying, there's lots of seats up here. Anyway, Adrian Van Kam was a seminary student in the 1940s in Europe. Now, if you're in Europe in 1940, what's going on? Yeah, there's something significant happening that has somewhat disrupted everyday life. He found himself thrust into difficult ministry by the German invasion. He's a very young man. He's actually a Catholic priest. But his approach to his job was, now I'm really a spiritual guy in this whole area. So I don't care whether you're Catholic or not. If you'll let me be good to you, I'm gonna. That was his approach. And he saw that in the community, when he would he'd go into people's houses and just about everybody would let him come in. And he saw that in some houses he'd go into, that their people were kind of grounded into a faith tradition. Meaning they didn't necessarily agree with him, but did they have faith in God? Did they believe in God or not? You'll recall that the 20s, actually I said 40s, I think this was in the late 30s when he's doing this work. But the 20s in Germany and in a lot of Europe was a very secularizing time. Kind of just across the continent, there was we don't need all that, let's party. World War I had ended, and people were, there was a lot of cutting up and a lot of drinking and a lot of philosophizing that was kind of hostile to spirituality of any kind. So there were a lot of folks in the 30s and 40s who were not grounded in faith traditions, that didn't believe anything really. They were agnostics or disbelievers. What Adrian Van Kam saw is that those people whose life had not been grounded into faith, when the war came upon them, when the disaster came, They were unprepared and their lives collapsed. But that people who truly believed, who had faith that this world was not the end of existence, and knew that there were things past this, that those people continued to be able to excel. His language was that they transcended their life. They rose above the trouble. They knew that they could die at any moment, and they were okay with it. I mean, obviously, nobody wanted to die, but the threat to their existence did not mean the end of their lives. Now, what he did as an academic, because the guy has a very academic mind, is he said, why is this true? What's going on here? Why is it that these people are collapsing and these people are not? What's the difference? And I've already identified the difference, but it took him some time to find that. What he eventually came up with is this idea of different phases in life having different challenges. And I think this is a very strong model. I think there's a lot that's good here. He actually has got about 15 books where he explores this reality in a lot more detail. He was a very prolific, he wrote a lot. And he broke these individual phases down into different challenges. Others have followed him and done the same. But his big, basic, overarching thing is that life could be broken into 3 big phases. The first is what he called the vital phase. Vital from the word for life, meaning you establish and begin your existence. This goes somewhere up into the late teens or early 20s. At least it did in his time period. It's probably moved into the late 20s now. But what the big job is in the vital phase is to develop a sense of personhood, determining who you are, coming to know yourself. And you remain in that vital phase until you really have, the big word is differentiated, meaning you know that you are connected to your family of origin, but you also know that you are not your family of origin, that you have your own thoughts. And while they may all be in alignment, or they may be very different from your family of origin, they are yours. Most of us can probably look back on a time in our life where we took our family's faith and decided what to do with it. Made it our own, or maybe took a step away from it. You know, I mean, maybe you're here in Church of Christ, and all the rest of your family is Baptist or Catholic, right? But there was some point where you said, no, I'm going to figure this out. I've got to know who I am. That is a vital phase task. You've got to, and when you finish that, he says you move on to the next phase. And the big goal here, he would say, that in terms of your spiritual development, your big goal is to find yourself rooted into a faith tradition, meaning discovering what faith posture you actually hold yourself and saying, this is where I'll sink my roots. I'm going to find myself here. Does that make sense? The next phase he called the functional phase, and this is a much longer phase of life. But here he says this is where you're performing. You've determined who you are in the vital phase, and you begin building life in the functional phase. So you don't have any wealth at all in the vital phase because everything is your parents, right? But here you move out and you begin a career, and you begin to say, I'm going to go get that. I want that house. I'm going to go buy that house. I want to be this for my livelihood. I'm good at this, and I'm going to do it. And so you settle into that. You know, you build a career. This is where you build your family life. And the functional phase is where, you build your social abilities, your ability to interact with children and raise those children up. These are all functional life tasks. And the functional phase is a fun one to go through because it is uphill all the way. Not meaning, it's a lot of hard work and drudgery, meaning there's always new vistas. I've always got my next goal. I know I'm in the functional phase when I'm looking forward to accomplishing something else, and there are still opportunities. Now, as I pass deeper and deeper into the functional phase, doors begin to close. I'm not going to be a veterinarian. That's not going to be my job. I think I'm still in this functional phase. I'm not going to be a vet. I'm not going to pick your options of other careers I could do. This is what I'm for. And I'm still building, I'm still moving forward. Okay, now the place where that ends, and I'm getting close, is the point where you hit what he called the mortality crisis. And for Van Kom and what we're looking at today, this is the most important thing. The mortality crisis hits when you realize that you've crested the hill and there aren't more vistas. And the reason you do it, according to Van Kom, is either because of a serious threat to your life or because of the realization that the people who were behind you are not as far behind anymore, or are perhaps excelling beyond you. That the person you trained in this job is now your boss. And you're going, what? It's where you start to realize that, okay, my abilities are being outnumbered by my limitations. I don't have as much ability now as I did. This sends people into what he calls the mortality crisis, and at this point, this is in many ways one of the most significant points in life. Because at this point, you either transcend the threat to your personhood or you collapse. And what he says everything depends upon is, at this point, is those first two phases. Have you set yourself into a faith tradition? Do you believe in God? And do you believe in God as more than an idea, but as a person in your life? If you believe in God and you believe the promises of your God, then you are prepared to continue climbing. There are, in fact, more vistas. They simply aren't here. That you go on preparing your heart and your soul for what's next, as you have been your entire life. If you are not prepared, and that does not mean that you don't give lip service to the existence of a divinity. A lot of people will say, yeah, I believe in God. Do you believe, though? Is that in your bones? Is it a real belief and a real relationship? We don't often use that term, but that knowledge that He loves me and I love Him and that His promises are true. And the difference between the reality of that and the artificiality of that shows up in the mortality crisis. You're either prepared to transcend or you begin to descend. In visual form, it kind of looks like this. Life is going up, and then you hit that mark where, which way is it going to go? And there are options. The mark that moves you from the first phase to the second is something that actually most cultures in the world are prepared to help people through. Our culture is messy about it. We spent that entire Hurt class, do you remember that? Talking about the absence of clear rites of passage. When are you an adult? When are you a child? Well, you can't go to this movie yet because you're a child, but you can die for your country, but you can't buy beer, but you can drive. What? When are you adult and when you're a child? Well, we don't really know in this culture. But here are some of the things that tend to force people, whether they get a rite of passage or not, is things like marriage. They're just kids. Well, they're not once they get married, are they? Because they start facing the real grown-up world. They have to deal with that other person. Marriage can be the thing that shifts you over. Or graduation, and just about any graduation, where you stop doing something you were doing, and the next phase of life starts, and you have to take up new responsibilities. Having a child will push you out of the vital phase, or it oughta. There are people who stay back in that vital phase, for decades. Yes, sir?
Mortality also falls back into the first one, like heavenly phase. nowadays because many children are facing that.
Yes, now that's true. The mortality crisis, he said the mortality crisis comes upon children nowadays, like with school shootings. You know, the fact that I could go to school and one of my classmates could kill me. We'll talk about that in just a moment because that transcendence phase can move. It can shorten the functional phase, or it can overlap with. But the idea that you become an adult, that's kind of where you move from the vital phase to the transcendence crisis is what moves you over here. I think I've already taught this, haven't I? I'm going to move on. Now, as you were just saying, a huge life crisis can shorten the functional phase. That's what Van Kaam first saw in World War II. People were living in houses that had holes in their roofs because bombs had fallen through them and failed to explode. You know, and you look at this 200-pound bomb sitting in your living room, and you're like, huh, that should have killed me and my neighbors. I ought to be dead now. Well, that kind of thing forces you to encounter that even if you're just in your 30s. And so this crisis of which way am I going to go in life can happen a whole lot earlier. Another thing that Van Kaam explored in a great deal of detail is something that was a real big deal in the 1970s that we called the midlife crisis. The midlife crisis is a failed transcendence challenge where you botch it and you don't make the transition into either transcendence or collapse. It's where you say, I want to redo on that test. I'm not going to do it. I refuse to deal with that. So instead, what folks do is they say, I'm going to go back to when I didn't have to worry about this in my life. When was that? When I was 28, I didn't have to worry. When I was 28, I was in love and I was happy and man, I really wanted a car. I couldn't buy a car, but I can buy a car now. And so I buy a sports car and I get an aerobics instructor and I run off and leave my wife. Okay? So that's a botched transcendence crisis. He's got an entire book dedicated to this called The Transcendent Self, where he says that the reason this is happening, and at the time he wrote this, it was like 78, and it was a real big deal. People were going to go, I got to find me. You remember the 70s when people would go off and find themselves? Like, dude, look inside your clothing. That's where you are. You're right there. Come on, you know. But this was because the culture was not preparing people to transcend at all. It was helping them to focus on themselves. And so we had a ton of these midlife crisis folks. What it is an attempt to go back to a point where I didn't have to deal with my mortality. And it always fails. It always fails because you're not 28, you're 53. You know, and the mortality crisis is very real. And the reason that people do this is because they do not trust God. If you trust God, you don't have to do this. That doesn't mean that it's easy. You know, because mortality is the reality. It's true. We are going to die. You know, that happens to everybody. On a long enough timeline, the survivability of the human race reduces to zero. Happens to all of us. How do you deal with that? And the big thing that Adrian Van Kaam found is that the only thing that prepares human beings for successful living late in life is their spirituality. It's their connection to God. If you have that, it doesn't mean that none of this matters to you, but it means that you can overcome it. If you don't have that, you're either going to become a blubbering jellyfish upon the floor, though you'll keep getting up and going to work, but you'll be a mess inside, or you'll have an affair. You know, somehow you're going to fall apart. And the failed mortality crisis is, honestly, one of the things this did for me is it helped me to understand and kind of, I don't want to say sympathy, but empathetic, particularly for men who blow up their lives. Because it tells me, okay, well, why would anybody do that? Because you don't have God. Even if it looks like you do. You don't. Or you don't do this. The the people who really have Him, they continue to grow and thrive. Does that make sense? This was useful to me. I hope it was to you. This next one's kind of fun, or at least I hope it's fun. It was fun for me. Has anyone ever heard the song 100 Years to Live? I'm 17 for a moment. You know that song? This next model helps us to kind of do that and work our way through life and its different challenges. The reality is that people are different at different phases of their life. They have different spiritual concerns. They're asking different questions about themselves and their lives, and they're facing different challenges. Now, the reason that this is incredibly useful to me is that last bullet point. The big questions of your life are the doorways into the presence of God. The things that trouble you, that concern you, the things that you, even if you're not troubled or worried, but you're really thinking about, the things that you plan about. Very often we approach those things as though God were not there. God is here when we come and sing, when we all get to heaven. But in terms of, well, what am I going to do about the pinching in my finances? What does that have to do with God? I've got to figure it out. No, these questions point to the places where our hearts will move most naturally toward God if we let them. Where our hearts will say, God, I need you here, and I'm going to explore this with you. Not necessarily because He's going to poof and make the problem go away, although sometimes He does. It's not ever poof. But have you ever noticed how the big worries of your life don't seem to happen? You know, and that you spent all that time stressing about something that was never going to happen to you anyway? But sometimes it might have happened, but you prayed. But anyway, these are points, they are avenues, they are open doors where you can step into the presence of God, and your heart will go there with some passion. Remember, the idea of that model of engagement and empowerment is that you go and be open with God. Well, because these are heavy weights on us, they drive our hearts to be serious about these questions. We're going to be serious about them anyway. Why not be serious about them with God? Does that make sense? So that's how these, to me, are very useful. For many of us, we're just going to hear a couple of these slides and just reflect on it, and it will demonstrate the validity of it. By the way, I should point out where these came from. My professor, Gordon MacDonald, was a guy who was in ministry for like 60 years. He started in his 20s and was in ministry all that time. And what he saw, what these questions come from, these are the questions people brought to him to bring to God. These are the questions that showed up in his counseling sessions with people. When he would sit down with people and say, okay, what's troubling you? These are the things that they would talk about. So in the 20s, people are trying to figure out who they are. What kind of man or woman am I? And how am I different from my family of origin? Do I want to be like them? Do I not want to be like them? Who am I? What will I do with my life? I've got all these abilities. I could do any of these career paths. Which one am I going to go down? Can I love? Am I lovable? And am I worthy of love? That last one's a very common question that people in their 20s are asking, especially if they've got a couple failed romances. They're like, I guess I'm not really worth anything. But that the big question of what is love? Baby, don't hurt me no more. Sorry. There's this song. No, anyway, what parts of me need correction? By the 20s, you've started to take possession of yourself and be responsible for correcting yourself. Your parents don't spank you anymore. Okay, so who am I and what do I need to fix? What needs to be made right? And around what person or idea or organization will I organize my life? What am I going to wrap my life around? People in the 20s are asking these questions. Does that make sense? You remember that? In the 30s, the questions shift to, how do I prioritize the demands being made in my life? Generally speaking, you've moved from having to figure out who you are to, oh my goodness, I have to get the kid to soccer practice. So how am I going to organize and structure my life? I've got more demands than I had before. And the amount of pressure is increasing. Now, my ability to cope is increasing too, but the pressure's heavy. So what am I going to do here? How far can I go in fulfilling my ambitions? People in the 30s are saying, can I write a book or not? No, can I make a career where I'll be the head of something? Or am I always going to be the number 2 guy? Or am I always going to be number 137642? You know, how far can I go? What am I? What are my limits? I have a dream of doing that. Can I make it? Who's part of my primary community? Do I have a primary community? Are there people around me that I can talk to and share what's going on in my heart and my life? What does my spiritual life look like? Do I even have a spiritual life? He says that in the 30s, people start hitting this crisis. Because you can coast through the late 20s, most people can. That if you had a spiritual family, it was kind of with you and you're on autopilot. But somewhere around the 30s, he said, most people start going, oh, wait a minute. Do I ever pray? I mean, do I ever make time to pray? Have I read the Bible? Have I read it all the way through? I don't think I've read it all the way through yet. What is my life in relationship to God? Have I done anything to prioritize that? He says, why am I not a better person? Shows up in the 30s a lot. Because through the 20s, you're still narcissistic enough that you think you are a pretty great person. You might have noticed that you've got a thing or two to correct, but you're going to manage that. No problem. It's going to be fine. By the time you hit 33, you go, well, that's a problem. And I haven't managed that, and maybe I can't. Maybe this is beyond me to do anything about. In the 40s, MacDonald suggested that a lot of people reflect on their childhood. That the 40s is just the whispering beginnings of the mortality crisis. And people start thinking about, what was it that shaped me? Who were the most formative influences on me? Why do so many people seem to be doing better than me? That's a very common question people hit in their 40s because they thought, by now, I'd be there and I'm here. So why am I not further along in this? Why have I not achieved more? MacDonald suggested that people in their 40s often overlook their achievements and start noticing their drawbacks. So why am I so disappointed in myself and in others? Again, remember, these are questions that were brought to him by people who were like, I need help with God. That is clearly a question where they're going, I don't understand the things that I'm doing. I don't know why, because I really thought I'd be better person than this. Or I really thought my dad was better. I did not expect this behavior out of him at this age. Why are limitations beginning to outnumber options? That by the 40s, really the die is cast, right? You know, you're not going to be a marine biologist. You really dreamed that you would, and someday you thought you'd go back to school and you'd do that, but you realize that at this point you can't go back to school because you got the kids, and the kids' needs outstrip your dream, and you're not going to do that, and that door is forever closed, and a part of your heart just died. And why is that? Why are there so many limitations hitting me now? And why does life seem to be so full of uncertainties that I have to face? I really thought that grown-ups weren't worried like this. I skipped the 50s. Did I skip the 50s? Well, that's not good. I'm sorry. Those were really good. That's too bad. That's it. I was underdeveloped when I was putting the thing together. Okay, the 60s. When do I stop doing the things that have defined me? In the 60s, people faced the question of retirement. And anytime people would meet you at, like, you know, you go to a public setting, what do they ask? What do you do? Yeah, they ask, what do you do? What do you do? Well, I'm this. Now I'm not. Or I'm thinking about not doing it. And who will I be if I don't do this? If I don't get up every morning and go there, who am I? because that's who I am. That's been who I am my whole career. Yes. So what is my identity if I have to stop doing that? Who will be with me when I die? And how will I die? Those mortality questions hit hard in the 60s. Why do I feel ignored by a large part of the population? Especially in this culture. He was a minister in America. And America has a youth focus. We pay attention to the young. People in their 60s, they've passed their prime, right? Time to downside.
That's not so true anymore, because this glut of population is now reaching retirement. You know, I'm at the front of the baby boomers, and more you see advertising pointed toward older people.
Well, now that's true.
You see
It's dollars and cents.
right, because this group of people still controls most of the wealth.
No, that's true. The baby
And-
boomers.
And so I think that was very true for a very long time, but I think either it is less true or it's being extended out.
I think perhaps you are correct. That question may more land now for people in their 70s than their 60s.
However, I think it's also true that if there's a financial component and a benefit to the other people not to ignore those of us that are in our 60s, then they will. But if you're just looking at in terms of what can you do for me, to the young people my age, we might as well be invisible.
Well, yeah, because, technology has so totally replaced you. You need my help. Actually, I need Isaac's help. The high school student is better at everything. Just ask him. I think there's probably a truth to both of those statements. That yes, because the elephant ate a gazelle in World War II, and that gazelle has moved through our culture, there is a huge population of boomers. That's absolutely true. And that the boomers have really demanded the attention of everybody.
And it's not going to go away because someone's going to have to take care of us, which means jobs, which is why so many people are being pushed into health care. And it also has to do with what the heck are we going to do with all these old people, because they're everywhere.
Those are good questions. I need to write that down. Let me. This is an excellent point, Susan.
You're not going to ignore me.
I'm not. Well, let me. The question of what is my spiritual legacy? A person in their 60s goes, okay, well, if things go the way they normally do, I've still got quite a bit of time to think about this, but I really need to start thinking about this. A person in their 40s or 30s is not really thinking legacy thoughts. They're still building dynasty. They're still building it. But a person in their 60s begins to say, okay, what am I going to leave behind me? I won't be here forever. Will I make a mark, or am I going to be a finger in a glass of water? And the finger comes out, the water closes, and doesn't even know it was there. Is that my legacy, or is there something that people will talk about when they get together? What's yet to be accomplished? He said that people in their 60s will often fire back up and say, okay, I want a second career. I did this, now I want to do that. And what does old age look for, and am I ready for it? Then the 70s and 80s, these are very poignant. Does anyone know who or what I once was? People look at me now, and they see this, and this is all they can see. But do they know what I accomplished? Do they know the heroic thing that I did? I fought in that war. I was once a young man filled with vitality, and I kept 10 people alive. And if I hadn't been there, those 10 would have died. Does anybody know that? Does anybody here? How much of my life do I control? As people head on, their kids come up behind them and often strip them of their dignity without intending to, trying to help them out. Am I still in control of my life at all? What can I contribute? I have all this experience. I have all this wisdom. Will anyone listen to me? Will anyone bother to ask for my stories? Why do I have so much anger and irritability? I really thought that by now I'd be a person of peace, but it's so easy to make me mad. Why is this here? Is God there for me? And am I ready to face death? Will I be missed? Now, those are all kind of poignant questions, and you'll notice that the thing throughout all of them is that they're pretty sad. Did you notice that? It's a broken world. And the shadow of the breaking lies over all of us, and it is hidden within us, but it's there. And it's not that, hey, we spend every day asking these questions. No, but these are the kinds of things that keep us up at night. These are the kind of things that make us, that are heavy on us. Do I have another slide? I think so. See, now a couple of points. If I am seeking the same spiritual experiences that I had at an earlier age, I may have stagnated or made an idol of that spiritual experience. We approach God, hopefully, to answer these sorts of questions because He has the answers, right? He can tell you who you are. He can tell you what you're for and what you can do. All of these questions are the kinds of things that we bring truly to God to be truly with God. But very often we kind of take spirituality and almost market it and make it into a thing that's kind of glitzy and packaged, or maybe this is what it's supposed to be. And we don't let it grow. We don't let it change. But the truth is, if you're still doing what you were doing in your 20s, if you're still saying, now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep. Well, in a way, if you're still doing that, that may be holy. Or it may be stagnated. And a lot of times people stagnate and are unable to really deal with the questions of life because they haven't progressed with God to bring the real questions to Him. They aren't seeking God in an age-appropriate way. Also, a congregation or even a generation may encourage spiritual stagnation because a group validates one age of spirituality as the norm while rejecting or discouraging the needs and priorities of other ages. Folks, I'm going to open a can of worms in the last 30 seconds, but hasn't that happened in our history here? I mean, didn't we have kind of two styles of worship at one point? Yeah, we did. And wasn't one kind of age appropriate to one group and one kind of age appropriate to another group? Yes, they were. But we said, no, one's right. That can happen. That is a very common blunder to tumble into. It encourages a specific kind of spirituality and says, this is right. Now here, hopefully, we are affirming both to some degree. But I just bring that up to cause us to realize that we ought to affirm one another's spirituality. If you're in your 60s or 70s or 80s and you don't build the spirituality of those in their 20s, then what will be your legacy? An empty building. And we have the job of saying, how do we affirm one another? Because I believe everybody here is genuinely seeking God. We're all also at different points in that journey, aren't we? I think it's really important that those of us who are further along don't despise those of us who are not, and that we build them up. And those of us that are not as far down the road know how to honor and respect those that are. We ought to build a culture like that. Wouldn't that be great? Let's take a moment and pray, and then we'll worship God. Great God in heaven, you have seen all of humanity through of its different ages, both the entire race as it passed from age to age, and each individual person as we pass from decade to decade. You know how to guide us all through all of life's challenges. Help us, Father, to do so faithfully, with love and honor for you, and love and honor for one another. May we be your true children in the ways that we behave toward you and each other. It's in Christ's name that we pray.